When I was a kid, I had some questions about the book of Revelation, and my dad led us through a Bible study on the book of Revelation. And we talked about all of the ways that Americans typically understand Revelation. That's the way we understood it at the time. And I remember going to bed afraid that the Antichrist was going to come and chop my head off. I was probably 7 or 8 years old. And for a very long time, I would go to bed thinking about this, and I would just be terrified. I also remember hoping that I would be able to accidentally receive the mark of the beast so that I wouldn't be killed for being a Christian, but I wouldn't have done something that God wouldn't forgive me for. So that was my childhood. And then as a teenager, the Left Behind books came out, and I devoured these books. I loved them. And this one says over 7 million sold in stores. These books were really popular with a certain segment of Christianity in the 90s and early 2000s, including me. I loved those books. But it created this idea about what the mark of the beast is. That's not at all what the mark of the beast is actually about. Back in the 90s, I remember Christians being afraid that the mark of the beast would be a microchip or a barcode that was either on or implanted into the forehead or the right hand. I've even heard things this year about the coronavirus vaccine being a way for Bill Gates to sneak the microchip into people and make them take the mark of the beast. All of these ideas are total nonsense and not at all what the book of Revelation is talking about. And the problem is that we've misread Revelation because we're unfamiliar with the genre of apocalyptic literature, and we're unfamiliar with the rest of the Bible. We make it into a secret code, and unfortunately, that turns Christians into conspiracy theorists. It shapes us into people who are the opposite of what Revelation is trying to get us to be. We become people who are fearful and suspicious and easily duped. And we become the kind of people who look to find our salvation through politics and government and economics, trying to use worldly solutions, which is exactly what the book of Revelation is telling us to not do. So, I want to give a couple of words of advice. First of all, if you're going to listen to somebody teach you about the book of Revelation, ask that person if they have read other apocalyptic literature from the Jewish Bible. It's fine to listen to people who haven't, but that's a word of wisdom, is ask the person if they've read other writing from the genre. I have read that. I'm not telling you that so that I can toot my own horn, but just to let you know, I think that's an important prerequisite if you're going to teach on Revelation. And secondly, if you're going to study and read Revelation, the prerequisite for studying and reading it is to really work your way through the book of Daniel as we have over the past few weeks. Today, we're going to be talking about the mark of the beast, which I promised probably 2 months ago, but we took a long time to get here because we needed to do the prerequisite work in understanding what the beast is in the Bible. We saw 8 weeks ago that in Genesis, God talks about beasts. He creates humans and he creates beasts. In Genesis 1, then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild beasts, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." One of the main purposes for God creating humanity was to rule over everything in the earth. God creates spiritual beings to rule in the heavens, human beings to rule in the earth, and we're called to have dominion or rule over the beasts, the living things. Then we saw in Genesis 3 that this beast, the snake, comes to Adam and Eve and says, "Do what God told you not to do." And they don't rule over the beast. They listen to the beast and they allow the beast to rule over them. They take on this idea of doing things without God, doing things their own way, doing what they think is best for themselves. And that's what sin is. Sin is doing what we think is best for ourselves instead of doing what God designed us to do, which is to bring his shalom, his harmony, peace, and wholeness to everyone around us, to nature, to the beasts. So they take this on, they do it wrong, they become beastly, they do what they want to do. Genesis 4, Cain is tempted to kill his brother, and God tells Cain, "Sin is crouching at your door like a beast, you must rule over it." Cain doesn't rule over the beast, he falls prey to what it wants him to do, this inner animal urge to do what he thinks is best for himself, and he kills. Next, we looked at the book of Daniel. In the book of Daniel, we spent 4 or 5 weeks there. It's all about the contrast between being a true human who lives God's way, seeking the well-being, the wholeness, the harmony, the shalom for everyone else, or being a beastly human, which is the way that all humans live. All humans live in this beastly way of domination. I want to do what's best for myself at your expense. And throughout the book of Daniel, we are pointed towards Daniel as an individual and his friends as a group who actually live in the way of true humanity. And finally, we come to Daniel 7, where there's this really strange dream that Daniel has of these four beasts that are progressively crazier, and they represent human empire. And so beasts in the Bible represent the human way of thinking of yourself first, especially when we're talking about human empires, empires that squash true humans and do things for their own benefit, for their own good. So now that we've done all this prerequisite work in what a beast is, we can finally talk about the mark of the beast. Last week we looked at Revelation 14, the mark of the Lamb, and today we're going to look at Revelation 13, which talks about the beast, including the mark of the beast. So it's in context of a larger section. So in Revelation 12, the dragon represents Satan. In Revelation 13, we're introduced to two beasts, which we'll be talking about today. Revelation 13:1 and 11. The dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on its horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. And then down in verse 11, then I saw a second beast coming out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. So Revelation 13 tells us about two beasts. One is sent by the dragon, and one speaks like a dragon. So they're rooted somehow in Satan, but they are beasts in the way that the Bible usually talks about beasts. Remember, beasts in the Bible represent empires or kingdoms, particularly powerful kingdoms or empires. There are two beasts, one from the sea and one from the land. Now, this book is written to people living in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. So some scholars think that what John is referring to is the faraway beast of Rome, which would be across the sea, and the nearby beast of the local culture and political movements and religion. That's a good possibility. I think probably the most precise way to talk about this is that the first beast represents nationalism and imperialism. So the Roman Empire in the context for the people who are reading this, but also all human power structures that dominate and squash humanity. And the second beast represents the religion that supports imperialism and nationalism. So the first beast is empire, and the second beast is the religion that supports empire. Let's look at the first beast, Revelation 13, 1 through 4. The dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on its horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear, and a mouth like that of a lion. The dragon gave the beast his power, and his throne, and great authority. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. The whole world was filled with wonder and followed the beast. People worshipped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast, and they also worshipped the beast and asked, "Who is like the beast? Who can wage war against it?" So this is the beast that is called the Antichrist, and people are constantly like, so-and-so might be the Antichrist, might be the beast. Watch out for the mark of the beast. As we talked about last week and when we looked at Revelation a few years ago, we don't need to read Revelation first and foremost as predicting future events. First and foremost, it says to take heed of the words of this text, take them to heart and live them out. So this is not just something meant for the future, but something that explains how humanity always is. When we read this chapter that way, it changes our response to this chapter. We have to take it seriously for right now. The beast is not just a future threat, but something about the way the world is today. And when we understand that the beast is a symbol for empire and nationalism, we have to understand that this is something we must deal with today, not just sometime in the future. So in the first verse, it says that the beast has 10 horns and 7 heads. Both of those numbers are numbers of completion, 7 and 10, whole numbers for the Hebrew mindset. These might refer to specific instances of 7 and 10. Later on, Babylon is called the city with 7 hills, which is referring to the city of Rome, not the city of Babylon. This could refer to that. But I think the main idea here is that this is a metaphor for completion. This is a beast that is a complete beast. It represents complete domination. Like the Roman Empire in its day, it is the most powerful empire at the time. But it also means that this is a representative of all human empires. This is a complete metaphor for all human power structures. It represents the complete human experience of dominant kingdoms and empires throughout time and throughout different geography. This beast, in verse 2, it says that it looks like a whole bunch of different kinds of things. The beast resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear and a mouth like that of a lion. The dragon gave it power. And all of those images are taken from Daniel 7, where there was an escalation of beast types. And the final one in Daniel 7, the Bible Project calls it the super beast. Well, here, this beast is a super beast because it involves all of the beasts of Daniel 7 into this beast that's described here. As we know, Daniel 7 is talking about empires. So this is talking about human empire being the beast from the sea, human imperialism, human domination. This beast is a conglomerate of Daniel 7, and that shows that this is not primarily in reference to any one particular empire. Now, the people who received this text were living in the Roman Empire, but this is beyond that. This is talking about all human power structures of subjugation and domination. It says in verse 3 that one of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound, but it had been healed. I think that this shows us a number of things about the way that human power works. Power-hungry and domineering cultures and the individuals who lead those power-hungry, domineering cultures have a tendency to overstate their strength and downplay or hide their weaknesses. So they will say, this isn't a fatal wound. This isn't a fatal flaw with our power structure or with our country. This is fine. This is fine. No big deal. I think another idea here is that the victory of Jesus on the cross has dealt a fatal blow to the human structure of domination. But the way of life that humans choose of domination and domineering and subjugation, that way of life persists even though it has been dealt a fatal blow. Verse 4 says, people worshipped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast, and they also worshipped the beast and asked, who is like the beast? Who can wage war against it? People worship empire. They worship powerful nations, and they say, who is like this nation? Who can wage war against it? Who is like the beast? You've never seen a country so great. In our country, America, there is one thing that conservatives and liberals usually agree on: American exceptionalism. Who is like the USA? Who can wage war against it? How does a nation become war-proof where no one can wage war against it? Through trusting in its military might. There's a difference between the military and militarism. Militarism is building up your military as your source of hope, investing all your money into it so that nobody can beat you. Who can wage war against it? I know this is an uncomfortable topic for us to talk about as Americans, but this is plainly the meaning of Revelation 13 if we're willing to read it in the original context instead of making it about a secret conspiracy code. It's a lot more comfortable, honestly, for us to say this is about Left Behind, and this is something I might have to deal with one day, or maybe not. Maybe I'll get raptured before it's an issue. If instead we say, no, this is the way that humanity works all the time, there's always the tendency towards beastliness, then it confronts where we are today, and we have to rethink how we're living and where we're putting our hope. Do you see how if you read this for what it actually means, it's not some future hypothetical thing? And it's also not something that's just new to 2020. This is how the world works and how it has always worked. There are always nations who think they are invincible. And when they operate that way, they're the beast. And they are empowered by the dragon. Thinking that you are invincible is a satanic way to think. Why? Because no one is invincible but God. It's a blasphemous way to think, to say, I'm invincible, or my nation is invincible. Who can wage war against us? Who is like us? Revelation asks the question of God, who is like him? He is holy, holy, holy. There is no one like him. So if a country or a person says, there is no one like me, they are putting themselves in place of God as holy, holy, holy. That's why verse 1 says that this beast has a horn with blasphemous names written on each horn and each head. Let's look at verse 5. The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies and to exercise its authority for 42 months. It opened its mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. It was given power to wage war against God's holy people, or saints, and to conquer them. And it was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. All inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, all whose names have not been written in the Lamb's book of life, the Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. What's the deal with 42? Well, 42 weeks is 3.5 years. 42 months is 3.5 years. And 3.5 is half of 7, which is the number of completion or wholeness. And so 3.5 and 7 are both very common numbers in Apocalypse. So when you see this 42 months, it could be a symbol of half of a complete amount of time or a complete period of time. And also, these can just be generic numbers that are common to the genre of Apocalypse. It's kind of funny, actually, that the number 42 is very heavily used in modern movie making, both in science fiction and in animation. So if you're watching a sci-fi movie, pay attention. You'll probably see the number 42. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the meaning of life is 42. Lost, one of the numbers was 42 15 years ago or whatever that was. There's lots of movies. I was watching some sci-fi movie the other day and it had 42 in it. It's just part of the genre. And so 42 is part of just the genre of apocalyptic literature. It's kind of an interesting coincidence that it's part of this genre as well. Also, 42 is the number of years in the Exodus story. There was a year beforehand, then 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, then a year before they went into the promised land. So the idea of 42 being throughout the book of Revelation is a constant reminder to the reader. We are enslaved to the way of the world, and God wants to rescue us from our slavery and bring us to the promised land. He is doing something like the Exodus within us, and Exodus is a major theme in Revelation. So the beast is given this power for 42 months. It opened its mouth to blaspheme God and slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. And what happens here is a mockery of Revelation 4 and 5, where we see God on the throne and Jesus, the Lamb who was slain, being seated with God as the true human and worshipped as part of God, as divine. And then people from every nation, tribe, family, language all gather together and worship God and the Lamb. Now here, the beast from the sea has subjugated people from every nation and tribe and language, and they end up worshiping the beast. And so this is a anti-Revelation 4 and 5, and that's why people talk about the Antichrist. This is an example of the opposite of Jesus. Often people think that verses 7 and 8 that are talking about every tribe, language, people, etc., is some sort of railing against globalism. And there were people 20, 30 years ago saying the European Union is going to be the beast of Revelation 13 or the United Nations. You might still hear those people saying that. Maybe today they're saying it's the WHO or something. This is actually about falsely taking the glory that God alone deserves. Only God, only the Lamb can bring together people from every ethnic group. Imperialism and colonialism is what it looks like when humans try to bring together people from every ethnic group under one ruler. And we can see throughout human history that's never worked. It doesn't actually bring people together. They may, for a time, give praise to the nation that has conquered them, but it will never last forever. Nothing will, besides God's kingdom. Revelation 13:9, whoever has ears, let them hear. If anyone is to go into captivity they will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword they will be killed. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of God's people. God's people need to recognize that this is the reality of the world. That always has been the reality of the world, and it will be until Jesus returns and defeats the beast. This is the way of the world, domination and subjugation of those who are living as true humans. This is what the beastly way of the world is. And so if anyone is to go into captivity they will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword they will be killed. This is the reality of the way things are. And the response is not to fight back or to try to take over the government or the beast and transform it. The response is patient endurance. It says this calls for patient endurance and faithfulness or loyalty or allegiance on the part of the people of God. This year, we've really talked about two big ideas all year, allegiance and the people of God. And I didn't realize it, but that's what this verse is about. That's the response to the beast, is to be allegiant to God, to be loyal to God, to be faithful to God as his people. That's our response. So the beast from the sea is any country, but especially powerful ones like Babylon, Assyria, Persia, Greece, Rome, Genghis Khan, the Aztecs, the Han Dynasty in China, the British Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the USSR, and yes, the modern United States. This first beast is human government, particularly empire. So do you put your trust in Jesus, the Lamb, or do you put your trust in human government? What is your source of hope? Is having a powerful country your source of hope? If so, you're hoping in the beast. Do you give your allegiance to the beast or to the Lamb? Verse 11, then I saw a second beast coming out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. It exercised all the authority of the first beast on its behalf and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose fatal wound had been healed. And it performed great signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to the earth in full view of the people. Because of the signs it was given power to perform on behalf of the first beast, it deceived the inhabitants of the earth. It ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. The second beast was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast, so that the image could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. This beast looks like a lamb, but speaks like a dragon. It looks like religion. It looks like spirituality, but it speaks like Satan. This beast, the second beast, is referring to religion that supports nationalism. Later in Revelation, this second beast is also called the false prophet, so a religious character who speaks falsely. In the time John was writing, he's talking primarily about the pagan worship of the Roman Empire, which propped up Caesar as a god and Rome itself as a goddess, as well as the religion of the place he's writing to, Asia Minor, where they had different gods and goddesses associated with their economics, with their governance, with their security. In the 4th century, the Christian bishop Eusebius of Caesarea and the Roman Emperor Constantine came together and fundamentally transformed the relationship between the Roman Empire and the Christian church. A couple months ago, we explored this story in a little more detail. What that means is that for the past 1,700 years, in many places, particularly in the Western world, a large part of the church has functioned as the beast out of the land, instead of functioning as the bride of Christ. And that shouldn't surprise us that that's possible, because that's exactly what Revelation 2 and 3 are all about. The church is tempted to find its identity in its local system of politics, economics, culture, society, and so on. And when it does that, it becomes part of the machine that props all of that up. When the people of God give their allegiance to the beast, they become the false prophet. Christian nationalism is not the same thing as Christianity. In fact, they're opposites. Christianity is trusting that Jesus is the hope of the world and giving him our allegiance, finding our hope in him, and working with him for the betterment of the place we live, but also for the shalom of all people in all places, loving and serving all. Christian nationalism, in contrast, is using Christian verbiage to prop up the nation that we have given our allegiance to, at the expense of those who are not like us. And that's what a lot of Christianity has been for 1,700 years, more like the false prophet, the beast from the land, than like the Lamb and the bride, the people of God. Verse 16, the second beast also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands or on their foreheads, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of man. That number is 666. What is the mark of the beast? First, it's called the mark of the name of the beast, or the mark of the number of its name. So this isn't just the mark itself, but the mark represents bearing the name of the beast. We've seen throughout this series that one of the ideas is that the people of God are to bear the name of God. The people of Yahweh bear the name of Yahweh. The people of Jesus bear the name of Jesus. And in contrast to that, The people of the beast bear the name of the beast. The people of the empire bear the name of the empire. Is this an individual? In a lot of our translations, it says, this is the number of a man in verse 18. But it can also just say this is the number of mankind. Is this an individual or a group? This is a group. As we've seen in the Bible, beasts are primarily empires. And in context, in this passage, it's clear that it's empires by how it uses Daniel 7 all the way up at the beginning of the passage. Also, we've seen that all humans live in a beastly way all the way back to Genesis 3, when we chose to not rule over the beasts, but allowed the serpent to rule over us. We've seen this by reading through Genesis and Daniel. When we understand what the Bible has to say about beasts, we can't say this is talking about a singular Antichrist just as a single individual, but a way that all of us tend to live. This is not talking about an individual person, but about the number of humanity. It says this is the number of humanity. That number is 666. Now, there are all different kinds of theories about what the number is, and it says to calculate the number. And this is why Christians tend to be easily susceptible to conspiracy theories, is because they can make it into anything they want. You really can make this into anything you want because you can use all different kinds of languages and ways of calculating numerical values. If you want to make someone out to be the Antichrist or the beast, you can do all sorts of manipulative things to numerology to make that person the bad guy. One Bible scholar writes, first, if the proper name by itself will not yield it, add a title. Mr., Mrs., Doctor, President. Secondly, if the sum cannot be found in Greek, try Hebrew or even Latin. Thirdly, do not be too particular about the spelling. We cannot infer much from the fact that a key fits the lock if it is a lock in which almost any key will turn. You can't just be applying this to whoever you don't like as the Antichrist, as the beast. All of us are like the beast, and all human power structures are like the beast. Here's what I think the mark of the beast is talking about. The Greek word for beast, or living thing or animal, is therion. And if you take the word therion and spell it in Hebrew, it adds up to 666. All Hebrew letters have a numerical value, and if you take the Hebrew transliteration of the Greek word therion, meaning beast, it adds up to 666. Triple sixes being one short of triple sevens. 6 was the day that humans were created in Genesis, and 7 was the day that God rested. So 6 throughout the Bible symbolizes humanity, and 7 symbolizes God. If you remember, back when Nebuchadnezzar built the tower, the statue, which was like the Tower of Babel, it was 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, 60 and 6. And so here in Revelation, we see something similar to that. There is this image of something that is very human and short of God's completion. Triple sixes, one short of triple sevens. This is a false trinity. Humans are enough, humans are enough, humans are enough. Instead of Father, Son, and Spirit are present and sufficient and worthy of praise. So the mark of the beast is talking not about a particular individual or microchips or something like that. The mark of the beast is talking about carrying the name of humanity and its way of being, carrying the name of empire and its way of domination and subjugation, living in a way that lines up with that. So why is this mark put on the right hand and the forehead? This is where people got the idea for barcodes in the 80s and microchips ever since then. Why did those marks go on those places? Deuteronomy 6 is one of the most famous passages in the Old Testament, the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And then a few verses later, it's talking about the commandments. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. The people of God were called to give their allegiance to Yahweh and to demonstrate it outwardly by tying the things that were connected with him to their foreheads and their hands. So in contrast to that, the mark of the beast is to tie your identification with the beast to your forehead and your hand. This is describing a way of giving your allegiance to something else. This is an anti-allegiance to God, being marked as the not people of God, but as the people of humanity, as the people of nation and empire. To be marked means to bear the name of someone, to identify with a certain person or way of being. What's also interesting is that this mark on the right hand and forehead is tied to economic prosperity. It also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands or on their foreheads, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of his name. To fully participate in our way of life, you have to participate in our economy. And to participate in our economy, you have to participate in our way of life. They go together. To give your allegiance to our country is to reap the benefit of participation in its economic system. To choose to not give your allegiance to our country means that you don't really deserve taking part in our economic system. These sound like current events right now in 2020, and it sounds like what all countries deal with all the time. We want people to be a working part of our society and to then participate in our economy as their reward. And if we say we're going to give our allegiance to Jesus instead of our country, that sounds strange to people, and they might not want us to be part of their economic system. In the first century, there was a much more direct connection between the two ideas than we would have in our culture and context, but it's still there. If you give your allegiance to Jesus instead of our system of politics, economics, society, and religion, you're strange and maybe even dangerous and unpatriotic and maybe even treasonous. That's how the system sees you. Bearing the mark of the beast means giving your allegiance to a way of life that is consistent with the false humanity that is exemplified in human empire and dominance and power. In contrast to that, giving your allegiance to Jesus and his way of true humanity means bearing the mark of the Lamb. As we saw last week in chapter 14, it immediately follows up this passage and says, "Then I looked, and there before me was the Lamb, standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, or that's all of God's people, who had his name and his Father's name written on their foreheads." So they're bearing the mark of the Lamb, in contrast to those who bear the mark of the beast. In Deuteronomy 6, it says to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to take that and bind it on your forehead and on your hands. And in Matthew 22, Jesus expands this commandment to include the commandment to love your neighbor as yourself. "Teacher, what is the greatest commandment in the law?" Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments." So the people of God, the people of the Lamb, are called to be those who bind on their forehead and on their hand the greatest commandment, which is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. So what is the mark of the beast actually about? This isn't about some future that you may or may not have to deal with because you're dead or raptured out of here. This is about the way that the world works and has always worked. There have always been beasts. There has always been the beast. And humans have always given their allegiance to the beast. The truth is that all of us have been bearing the mark of the beast. The question is, what are you going to do from now on? Are you going to keep bearing the mark of the beast, or are you going to bear the mark of the Lamb? Right now, today, do you give your allegiance to Jesus, the Lamb who was slain? Or do you give your allegiance to the way of humanity, the way of dominating others, the way of nations and empires? Now, it's one thing to say you give your allegiance to Jesus instead of nations, empires, and humanity, but do you actually live that way? The way we bear the mark of the beast is by simply fitting into participating in our culture without thinking critically and critiquing what is inconsistent with God's way of bringing shalom to everyone. But the way we bear the mark of the Lamb is to live in the way that Jesus reveals true humanity. Love God, love your neighbor.